Good evening. I am Father Smoke, and welcome to the Void. Years ago, when I was 8, my family lived in this big, weird house, kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to very different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the doors were all locked. One morning, I noticed that the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left, I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon, the light was on, and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning. So, I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs, I looked, and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door, and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months, I didn't tell my family because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost, and I didn't think anyone would believe me. Then, about a year after that incident, my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800 to $900, but never more than $60 at once. So, we all walked around the house with flashlights, trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out, some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up in the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I've ever had. I was responsible for opening a new office for a previous employer. The receptionist that we hired was this sweet little old lady who would always bring in cookies and brownies almost every day. She said her husband has a sweet tooth and she doesn't know how to make just enough for the two of them since all the kids moved out. So, she's always making too much. She would always tell us funny stories about what her husband said or did the night before. He sounded like a fun guy, and she was absolutely the sweetest little old lady, or so I thought. A few months later, her husband was reported missing by her adult kids. They said they hadn't heard from him since Christmas, and that their mom was very evasive when they would ask to talk to him on the phone. After a little investigating, the police found the husband hacked to pieces in this sweet little old lady's trunk. It turns out on Christmas night, she slit his throat in his sleep, used a hacksaw to cut him up, rolled all the pieces up in a carpet, and tucked him into her trunk. Here's the creepy part. We hired her in June. They found the body in August. The whole time I knew her, his body was wrapped in a carpet in her trunk. She was bringing in cookies and telling us funny gem stories. All the while, he was decaying in her trunk. A long time ago, when I was a dumb missionary in Brazil, my companion and I were approached by a seemingly homeless man who greeted us in almost perfect English. Turns out, he was an American who had been living in Brazil for about 30 years. His name was Brickford. He had to have been in his late 50s to 60s. It was hard to tell because of his big beard and very unkempt appearance. He feigns interest in what we were peddling and asked for a copy of the Book of Mormon, but is clearly more excited to be speaking English with two Americans. We meet up with him a few more times to discuss religion, but he would always meet us at the side of the road or some other public, but still secluded place. We had to give weekly reports to the leader for the local unit about who we were meeting with and teaching. After meeting with Brickford a few times, we bring him up in our weekly meeting. The bishop and his other leaders instantly know who we are talking about and caution us to stay away from this guy. Apparently, he's a bit unstable and once or even twice a year will start bothering the missionaries. My companion and I can't believe that the bishop is referring to the same person, and we continue meeting with him. I don't know how to adequately describe the creepiness of this guy. Between his disheveled appearance, flat-out lying to us, and other small signs, he had a certain sinister vibe. But with nothing concrete to put our finger on, we continued to speak to him. Occasionally he would run into us right outside the house we lived in. One night, after talking about his house in the jungle and how nice and wonderful it was out there, he agrees to have us meet him on the side of the road in front of his house so he can guide us down the path to his house. The time arrives, and we are waiting patiently by the side of the road, but Brickford is very late. Just as we are about to leave, he arrives and takes us down the path into the jungle. At this time, it's very dark, and we were walking through waist-high foliage. This area had roads and cities, but was right next to a large reservoir, and if you left the main roads, it could become very isolated and overgrown very quickly. As we walked down this path for what seemed like forever, I kept walking into spider webs with my face and almost losing it. I hate spiders, and the ones in Brazil were the stuff of nightmares. Luckily, I carried a small LED flashlight, but it seemed woefully underpowered out here in this jungle. When we finally arrived at his house, my companion and I played it cool, but we couldn't believe what we were seeing. He had led us to a small clearing. There was a wooden cabin that had half collapsed in on itself. He said, "Welcome home," and led us inside. There was no electricity, no running water, no utilities whatsoever. We walked into the front door, or door frame, and saw that all the furniture in the house had been destroyed. Literally, someone had concentrated a large amount of effort and time to achieve this level of destruction. Chairs were unrecognizable, and there was trash everywhere. He began showing us the main room inside the front door. That's when I noticed them. Notes in chalk on every square inch of the wooden walls, up the walls, on the ceiling, and a tiny, frenzied scrawl. When I trained my light on the notes and started to read them, most of the notes were variations on "Jesus will forgive me, but I have to stop. I have to stop it again." With the notes, a month and date written next to them, the names of several children with their ages and graphic sexual detail about them. We tried so hard not to mention the notes. We tried so hard to ask him small questions about the rotting food on the stove or the 100 or so rats he kept in his basement. Anything but mentioning the notes. I can't speak for my companion, but I was freaking out. From glances at each other, I could see that he was absolutely horrified as well, and we decided to get the hell out of there. We made some excuse, as it was getting late, and that we needed to get home, and he reluctantly offered to show us the way back, on the condition that we would come visit again as we get out of the house. He suddenly remembers that he knows a shortcut, and tells us to follow him. The direction he's trying to lead us is clearly not the way back to the road. It only led deeper into the jungle. We politely declined, and luckily, we were able to follow the trail that we had originally made through the underbrush. This time, however, I did not give a shit about the spiders. When we got back onto the road and realized we were safe, we looked at each other as if to say, did that really happen? Once we started talking about what we just saw, I was so terrified that I could physically not speak. Nothing like that had ever happened to me, nor since. I absolutely could not make a sound. I was so scared. My companion called our leaders, who called their leaders, and we ended up moving out about a week later, but not before making an entry in our area book, the book that stays in the area, listing who had been talked to and who to contact in the area, warning all other missionaries to stay away from this guy. When I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team, typical social team, out for beers and pizza after with the guys, family event type thing. My parents were good friends with the other two couples. Both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other two couples had left their kids at one of their houses with a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night, but I was being really fussy and my mom nixed the idea, though my parents 100% would have normally gone back to hang out. Well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. Two men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. They then took the parents hostage as well, and made the dads drive them to banks and grocery stores, where one dad was a manager and had to clear out the accounts and safes. They then came back to the house and slaughtered both families, the babysitter and her boyfriend, kids included. They caught the other two guys later on. My dad attended the trials and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day. When I was about 8 or 9, my family lived in a house in a little hidden neighborhood on a cul-de-sac. It had a huge backyard, but there was a rusted-out trailer, the flat kind you use to tow dirt bikes and whatnot, in one corner of the yard. That area of the yard always gave us the creeps, so we never went over there. Neither did our dog. My two younger sisters shared a room, but they would come sleep in my room every once in a while because they said that there were weird lights in their room. My parents passed it off as the street lights bothering them. One night, I woke up to this weird feeling of anger. It was like when you're standing next to someone that is murderously pissed at you. There was a shape of a person standing in the doorway, and a single red glowing light like the cherry of a cigarette. Both my parents smoke, so I thought it was one of them. I sat up and said, "Mom? Dad?" But there was no response. And then the figure and the red light were gone. I pulled the covers over my head as quickly as possible and made myself into a tight little ball. Then there was a tug on the blankets at the bottom of the bed. I pulled the blankets back and there was another tug. I was terrified and unable to move, so I just held on to the blankets as hard as I could. The tugging stopped, but I was frozen with fear. Eventually, I fell asleep again. When I asked my parents about it in the morning, both of them said they were asleep the entire night, and it must have just been a nightmare. Fast forward some 20 years, I used to have nightmares about the house, especially the corner of the garage turned den, which looked like a black hole in my dreams. It was a one-story house, but I used to have dreams of running down the stairs in the den, where I knew if I went too close to the black hole, that something evil would get me. I also had dreams about the other houses in the neighborhood being evil, and if I went to them for help, that I would die. My younger sister and I were talking about the house with our mom one night, and she described having the exact same nightmares, but we had never spoken about it before. In her dreams, she would run down the stairs and into the kitchen, where the cupboards would be opening and closing by themselves. There would also be a man standing in the den near where I would see the black hole. Needless to say, all three of us were pretty creeped out. I've been by the house a few times still, and get this eerie feeling when I come into the neighborhood. Maybe, just maybe, it was built on an Indian burial ground. When I was about 9, we lived in a house that my father built for us in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. My parents owned a small business that often brought clients to our remote little homestead, and over the years, we met some rather odd people. One such person was a strange man that gave me the chills as soon as I saw him. He arrived in our home in a black car with tinted windows, wearing all black with a black hat and dark sunglasses. His demeanor was very strange, and he was very interested in our black Persian cat named Mercedes. Nevertheless, he left after his consultation with my parents, but later at dinner, everyone admitted that he had set them on edge. That night, Mercedes came down very ill. A few days later, after an illness the local vet couldn't diagnose that included the cat vomiting up gobs of what appeared to be black tar, Mercedes died. In her final moments, she would swat and hiss at something in the air. I'll never forget the chill I got when she took her last breath. After this, many strange things began happening around our home. We'd find footprints in the snow that started and stopped out of nowhere. Noises in the middle of the night. The wallpaper would be torn halfway off the walls. My mother, who has always been somewhat of a sensitive person, claimed to start seeing demonic creatures around the house and became rather withdrawn. I had asthma, but had been a long while without an attack. Soon after all this began happening, I started having episodes again. I was very sick one night, so I slept on the floor next to my mother's side of the bed in my parents' bedroom. Under their bed and around were a bunch of boxes, family photos, wrapping paper, etc. Things that we had been meaning to store elsewhere. In the middle of the night, I had had a particularly bad asthma attack. I heard my mother wake up screaming, "Get away from her!" and trying to get to me. Every box from under the bed and around the room had been stacked between where I lay on the floor and my mother's side of the bed, preventing her from getting to me. She finally reached me and gave me my inhaler, and she cried all night. She never told me what she saw that night, but strange things continued to happen for several more months. We had the house blessed and tried everything we could. Eventually, the activity started to slow. My brother and his family live in the house now, and they hear unexplainable sounds every so often, but nothing like what happened that winter. I grew up to be quite a skeptic, but I still can't explain what happened that year. I just tell myself it was all in our heads.